So if you've seen other videos of mine, you would know that Resident Evil is probably my most talked about topic on this channel, mainly just because I love this series. It's one of my favorite, if not my favorite, video game franchise of all time. And honestly, a big reason for that definitely has to do with the locations, the iconic locations that each game has us explore every time we dive down into a Resident Evil game. And with so many iconic and unique locations throughout the series, it's really hard to narrow it down to just a few about which ones are the most iconic. But you know what? I damn well can try. So my name is Ruben with NerdSpace, and here are my personal top 15 iconic locations in the Resident Evil franchise. Let's get it. So number 15, the hospital in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and Resident Evil 3 Remake. So it's a really small location as there's not too much to explore here. I would say roughly once you get to the hospital, you probably have about an hour maybe of the game left. But honestly, the whole hospital scene during an infection, during an outbreak, is probably one of the most iconic settings for the genre. When you think about Walking Dead, one of the most iconic scenes is seeing Rick walk through a hospital that is completely abandoned. Something about it just adds a sense of horror and terror as you're exploring the hospital. And Resident Evil 3 actually does a really good job at kind of adding to that fear and adding to that atmosphere whenever you're exploring the hospital. But it's also one of the first time we actually see the Hunter come back into the modern era of games with Resident Evil 3 Remake. Also, there's some really intense moments in the hospital, from the zombies breaking through the glass as you're heading back to the lobby, to crawling around the dark and hearing zombies banging on doors and busting through doors as you're trying to find specific items throughout the hospital. Honestly, it's probably my favorite part about the Resident Evil 3 Remake. That section I really enjoyed, and I actually felt the tension and the horror in that section compared to the other sections of the game. So number 14, the training facility, and that's in Resident Evil 0. So I want to start off by saying that Resident Evil 0 is probably one of the most underrated video games of the franchise, specifically because Resident Evil 0 is pretty hated by a lot of people. For some reason, people really do not like that game. But one thing I felt like stood out a lot for the game was the training facility, because it had a lot of kind of Easter eggs and similarities to the Spencer Mansion, which you kind of see as a recurring theme in a lot of Resident Evil games. There's always a section in a Resident Evil game that kind of resembles the Spencer Mansion setting a little bit. Anyways, it's really interesting to explore the training facility because you get to see more of Umbrella's backstory, and you get to see what the Umbrella employees had to go through for their training process and stuff like that throughout this building, including some like test chambers and torture devices and stuff. Here in the training facility, you can actually see what Umbrella has been doing and what their training process was like, and it's pretty fucked up, honestly. So I think this is definitely an underrated location, and I had a lot of fun exploring this. And while it's definitely nowhere near the top, I think Resident Evil 0 is a decent game, and you guys should at least give it a shot if you haven't already. Maybe you've been avoiding it because you hear all the negative feedback on the game, but maybe just give it a shot because it's not an awful game. It's not a bad game. So number 13, the streets of Raccoon City, and I'm specifically focusing on Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and Resident Evil 3 Remake here. So this is the first game that you actually really get to explore the streets of Raccoon City. You kind of get a little tease at it in Resident Evil 2 Remake and the original. And if you actually play the Outbreak files, you actually get to explore more of Raccoon City. However, for mainline titles, this is the only game where you actually get to full-blown explore the streets of Raccoon City. And you really feel like you're in a city this time. It seemed like a missed opportunity when Resident Evil 2 first came out, that you're pretty much in an RPD station almost the entire time, which, don't get me wrong, I love the RPD station, but it really seemed like a missed opportunity that we didn't get to explore more of the city. And Resident Evil 3 actually allows you to do that. And it actually adds so much more horror to the environment because you are walking down streets. Everywhere you turn, you see a zombie, you see someone getting eaten alive. It's a dark setting to be a part of. And while in the remake it doesn't feel as scary because you don't have Nemesis surprising you as much as he does in the original game, it's still a pretty horrifying experience to walk into a donut store and see zombies walking around. That's how scary it is, because you're going to normal, everyday situations, everyday locations, and seeing death in front of you everywhere you go. So number 12, the Umbrella Facility. And when I say that, I'm talking about the one that's under Raccoon City, which means you visit this location in Resident Evil 2, the original and the remake, as well as a small little cameo in Resident Evil 0. The lab is just scary because it's connected to the sewer, so it's just, the way you enter the lab is just unique. The cable car fight is something that just completely catches you off guard for the first time. You don't really expect it. You go up against William Birkin just before entering this section, and there's some really unique creatures in the lab that you don't see anywhere else in the Resident Evil franchise or anywhere else in any location in Resident Evil 2. Not to mention, this was a really iconic moment whenever you're trying to escape the facility while the timer is ticking down because the lab is about to blow up. Something about that was just really intense and had your heart racing, especially in the original game. For some reason, the original game did it better. Whenever that alarm first went off in the Umbrella Facility and the place is about to blow up, your heart is beating like fast as hell. And just trying to escape that facility before it blows up is such a very adrenaline-like feeling. And I really liked that portion of the game, especially once that alarm started. Something about it completely changed the environment. And I still think the original Umbrella Facility versus the remake, I still think that original one is still more unique and I like it so much better. However, both versions of the Umbrella Facility are really cool, and one of my favorite locations, just barely missing out in the top 10. Number 11, Castle Dimitris, and this is in Resident Evil 8 Village. Okay, first off, I don't know how to pronounce that name. I'm pretty sure I'm butchering it. I looked online and this is how it says the name is supposed to be pronounced. So if you guys are about to hit up those comments and say you are pronouncing that name wrong, I am sorry. I really don't know how to pronounce it. I just call her Lady D. I always have. But in all seriousness, this castle is a very unique location and something that I feel like definitely is one of the best parts of Resident Evil 8 Village. Now, if you see my ranking for all the Resident Evil games, I'm pretty sure if you're a fan of the Village game, you guys are also very disappointed with my ranking list, because I actually had Village pretty low on that list, and it mainly just had to do with the fact that I'm more of a horror fan of the franchise, so I appreciate the horror games more than the action-focused games. And I felt like Village is slowly heading on the road towards Resident Evil 6. It's not there, it's not close, but it's on the road heading there. And that's what scared me about that game. However, there are two locations specifically that jumped out to me. I'll jump to the other one in just a moment. But Castle Dimitris is actually a really awesome location, and it definitely kind of jumps back into the old school survival horror games where you have to find keys to unlock doors and backtrack a little bit while also being careful around the creatures that you run across. It definitely feels more horror than a lot of parts of this game, in my opinion, with the exception of one other part. Talking about you, baby monster. But this section of the game was exciting for me because I was really interested in it. And I was looking forward to the rest of the game because honestly, this is at the start of the game for the most part. And I felt like that if the game continued down this road, if it just followed the same style as Castle Dimitris, then the rest of the game would have probably been in my top 5 maybe. Now, I do think the castle could use some work, and while it wasn't as creepy or as pleasing as some of the other locations on this list, I do think it was a great attempt for this game. And honestly, I would have been really happy if the castle was just expanded and most of the game was just focused on this one location, because I liked what they were going with this specific setting until they kind of strayed away with it by going to the other locations. Number 10, House Benevento. Hopefully I'm pronouncing her name right, because I'm pretty sure I'm definitely off there, but honestly, this location is definitely the scariest location out of the entire Village game. mainly just because of a specific segment. But even with that segment taken out of it, even the upper part of this location had a little intense, scary, paranormal vibe to it, honestly. But anyways, there are 2 unique encounters in this location, and while there's not that many enemies, there's really not that many enemies at all, actually, with the exception of 2 encounters. This location definitely made me feel the fear and anxiety of just being in this house, and I really enjoy that, and I really like that. And I think that's why this location stands out more than any other location in Village, because this location actually made me feel like it was a horror game. So there are 2 really unique encounters I mentioned earlier. The first one is when you go into the basement and you come across this baby, terrifying monster-like creature that's chasing you through the halls in pure darkness. And the only way to get away from it, because you can't fight back against it, your only defense is running and hiding under the beds and closets, whatever you have to do to get away from this baby monster while it's screeching and screaming as it chases you. It is terrifying, and the fact that you can't see anything because it's dark even adds to that anxiety and fear. And even when you escape this segment, you go back upstairs and you face another terrifying experience as you're fighting this possessed doll throughout this house, and you have to find her before you get killed. It's a really intense moment, and to me it actually adds a new feel to the Resident Evil franchise, because you never really had the whole paranormal side of things that much until this game. You got a little taste of it back in Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 4. The original plan for that game was supposed to lead more into the paranormal side. This time with this doll fight, you actually have a little taste of what the paranormal side of Resident Evil could look like. And I thought that was really unique, and between those 2 boss encounters and the setting for this house, the terrifying environment, the fact that you're fighting in the darkness against a baby monster, or you're fighting against a possessed doll throughout this creepy old house, both settings inside this one location make it unique and definitely helps it break the top 10. Number 9. The Queen Zenobia, and this is actually in Resident Evil Revelations. So out of all the spin-off games for the franchise, I feel like Resident Evil Revelations is probably the scariest in my opinion. Mainly just because of that introduction to the game and the setting itself and the very unique creatures and monsters on the ship. It's a really great game that I definitely recommend playing. First off, the concept of being stuck on a cruise ship while battling the infected is just a really awesome concept, because you have nowhere to go. You can't go anywhere. You're in the middle of a storm on a ship fighting these monsters, and there's no way for you to escape. And of course, you bring back unique characters like Jill and Chris into the franchise, while also introducing some really unique characters. While they might not be some of my favorite characters, they are new and interesting characters added to the franchise. But the ship is the main focus here, because whenever you're going through the ship, it actually feels amazing, because it definitely dives back to some of those old school Resident Evil games where you're going back and backtracking through the different lobbies of the ship to unlock different doors once you get specific keys from different sections. And there's so many unique locations because it's a cruise ship, so you have a ton of different unique locations, like all of the different beautiful lobbies and grand staircases, as well as the cafeteria where you face off against a really awesome boss fight. And all the while the ship is moving, and you can actually feel it moving at some parts of the game. Not to mention, whenever it gets to a specific point, the ship starts flooding, so you start experiencing some of the same areas, but now it's been flooded over and you have to dive down and swim around the locations. Some really unique way to take the Resident Evil franchise, and I think just being on a ship with a bunch of infected is really awesome in my opinion. So with the unique creatures on this amazing ship, it definitely makes this ship a terrifying experience and definitely earns its spot as number 9 on this list. Number 8, the Ecliptic Express and Resident Evil 0. So if you see my ranking video when I talked about the different Resident Evil mainline games and I ranked them all from worst to best, Resident Evil 0 was on that list, and one of the things I really liked about the game was the train at the beginning of the game. I felt like this was the best part about Resident Evil 0, and I wish it was explored a little bit more because it only lasts about 20 to 30 minutes. However, similar to what I said about Revelations when I was talking about the Queen Zenobia, the train is such a perfect location for a survival horror game, because the tension and the anxiety and the horror of just being on a very enclosed space on a train while zombies are coming from both directions is terrifying. And it's such a unique setting in the franchise. You actually don't really see that setting explored in any other game. Sure, you have boss fights like in Resident Evil 6 on a train and in a train, but Resident Evil 0 is the only one that really explored fighting zombies and creatures on the train. And while there's only so much you can really do on a train and explore on a train, they actually did a really good job at making some of the locations on the train feel unique. If only they added a more interesting boss fight on the train, I feel like it would have been 10 times better. That being said, another thing I really liked about what they did, and I wish they actually did a little bit more of, is that there's a lot of dead bodies on the train because they were pretty much killed and infected, and they're just laying in chairs. And as you're going through each cart, they might not come up to life at that moment in time. However, maybe when you're coming back, they might rise out of their seats. That was an awesome mechanic that they added, and it was really cool. And I think if a game focused more on that, it can make the train aspect feel even more terrifying. Again, like I said about the cruise ship, being on a cruise ship where you have nowhere to go, no way to escape is terrifying. But being on a train where there's only 2 directions to run, and it's very narrow and you can't really dodge the zombies because it's a very narrow space, and your only chance is to kill all the zombies in one direction so you can get away from them, I find that so much more scary, and I definitely love the location, and I wish it was a little bit more expanded upon. I don't know how much they can do because, again, it's a train. There's only so much you can do with the train, but I really like that location, and it was definitely my favorite part about Resident Evil 0. Number 7, the Spanish Village. And this is in Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 4 Remake. So if you don't know what I'm talking about the village location, which pretty much takes place of the entire first segment of Resident Evil 4. So whenever you first enter the village, all the way up until you enter the castle is the segment I'm talking about. And there's a lot of really unique locations here because you have the lake, you have some of the village locations, you have the big cabin fight, and also you have a big fight in the village itself where the bell tower is. There's some really unique locations here, and honestly, this is one of the biggest things I really liked about Resident Evil 4. While I'm not huge on the action side of things that Resident Evil 4 kind of went down the road towards, I really do like the unique locations that they focus on. And the Spanish Village is one of those amazing locations that they did. I can go on and on about the different locations just in the village because it's really that expansive. So first off, Resident Evil 4 Remake does a really good job about creating the atmosphere of horror versus just the normal everyday village where it kind of felt cartoony in the original game. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the original game to an extent, but I feel like the remake definitely made it feel more of a horror game than the original. And that first fight scene in the village with the bell tower and everything and all the different buildings you can go in to escape the creatures, the monsters, it definitely is a unique feeling that honestly stayed with us all of these years ever since the original game came out all those years ago. And like I mentioned earlier, there's so many unique locations inside the village. You have the Los Lagos Lake. The open world in the remake allows you to explore the village a little bit more and explore the lake more even. You have the bell tower, which is a very unique staple in Resident Evil 4, and actually in the remake it actually falls down and scares the hell out of you, which was a really unique mechanic because then it changed the landscape to an extent of that village. You have the church, you have the graveyard, and like I mentioned earlier, you have the cabin fight. So there's so many unique locations in the village itself before you enter the castle that it definitely deserves a spot in the top 7 on this list, hence why it's number 7. But it's not the best location actually in Resident Evil 4. Number 6, Castle Salazar, Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 4 Remake. So specifically, I want to focus on the remake because the remake's version of Castle Salazar is far superior to the original in my opinion. This was the best improvement from Resident Evil 4 to the remake outside of the mechanics and the atmosphere. And that's because in the original game, the castle felt out of place. It didn't feel like a castle, it felt very cartoony, and it felt like it had a lot of different locations that didn't really make sense, and a lot of mechanics like the running statue of Salazar didn't really feel right for a Resident Evil game. However, the Castle Salazar in Resident Evil 4 Remake feels so much more like a castle and is so much more unique. First off, the atmosphere of the castle itself, because it's all set in darkness and you have the fog setting now in the Resident Evil 4 Remake, it definitely makes the castle feel that much more intimidating when you first enter through those gates. Then your very first encounter in the castle is one of the infected Ganados turning into one of those parasite creatures. And the way it's done definitely adds more of a horror element to the castle. Then you have the texture and the graphics adding to the environment that makes it feel more like a castle. And then segments of the game really stand out. Specifically, one of my favorite parts of the castle is that dungeon scene. Whenever you're going through the dungeon and you fall through the floor, and you come face to face with that creature in the basement. I'm not going to butcher the name of it, so I'm not going to say it. But that's the very first time you come face to face with one of those claw-like creatures. And it is terrifying how they handle it. And then they added elements of chains hanging from the wall, where if you just slowly touch one of those chains, that thing can come running at you because it can hear that. And everything about the castle, to me, in my opinion, feels more horror, feels more terrifying, and feels more like a real castle instead of something out of an animated TV show, which I felt like the original Resident Evil 4 Salazar Castle felt like. So it definitely deserves spot number 6, and it's my favorite location in the Resident Evil 4 remake. Number 5, Rockfort Island and Resident Evil Code Veronica. So Rockfort Island is such a really awesome location because basically it follows Claire, where she ends up on this island because she is captured and locked away by Umbrella military officials. And she is locked away and an infection breaks out, and now she's on an island full of zombies and there's no way to escape, and that's her only goal, is to escape this island before these creatures get to her. And I just like the whole concept of being on a military base and an island that's isolated from the world, full of creatures and zombies. It makes so much more sense in a situation like Raccoon City, whereas I like the Raccoon City setting. However, an outbreak in a city is more likely to kind of be discovered by the government and taken care of immediately, whereas an island, it definitely makes more sense for an island to have an outbreak and no one to really know about it, and nobody's going to do anything about it. So I really love the concept of Rockfort Island, of exploring the island that is isolated from the world. And there's some really cool, unique settings on the island. First off, you have the Ashford Estate, which is pretty much the place where the Ashford twins are staying at, which is kind of hidden all the way in the back of the map, but there's other really unique locations just on Rockfort Island. You have the military base, the prison section, you have the palace that kind of resembles the RPD Station a little bit, sort of. So there's some fan service there. And then there's even a boss fight on an airplane, although technically that's sort of leaving Rockfort Island, so I'm not sure if that counts, but I'm gonna count it anyways. You have a boss fight on a plane, and it's scary because all it takes is one hit and you're knocked off that plane. It's a really unique location, and I absolutely love this location. And I think this is why I feel like Code Veronica should get a remake, because it has some of the most unique locations. And this one isn't even my favorite one. Number 4, the Antarctic Base in Resident Evil Code Veronica. So as I mentioned, Rockfort Island is a really unique location, and I really love it, hence why it breaks the top 5. But it's not my favorite location in the game. Actually, my favorite location in the game is the Antarctic Base, because I find that to be so much more unique and exciting. First off, I want to say that the Antarctic Base is probably the best Umbrella laboratory facility in the entire franchise. When you compare it to the laboratory in the first Resident Evil game, or even the one that's on this list earlier on this list, the Umbrella facility in Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 0, it definitely surpasses this on every level. And mainly it just has to do with 2 things. One, the setting. There's a lot of different iconic locations inside the Umbrella laboratory in the Antarctic that it just makes it stand out more. For one, you get some little Easter eggs towards the original Spencer Mansion. There's a location that's completely dedicated to the Spencer Mansion. And I really like that they added that, because it was a cool callback to the original game. Even adding some similar puzzles to the original game that kind of resemble it in Code Veronica in this palace, I thought were really cool Easter eggs. Then you have some other really unique locations, like battling a creature with a sniper rifle on top of a rooftop in the middle of the Antarctic, so you're probably freezing your ass off. Or even battling a giant spider on top of a frozen ice skating rink almost. Some really unique boss fights and really unique locations with the Antarctic Base, but that's not the only thing that makes this location interesting. It's also the fact that you get to see this location in 2 specific perspectives. Because when you first visit the Antarctic Base, you visit as Claire. And when she comes there, it's just a normal base. Nothing unique about it other than the fact that it's just a really cool location. However, whenever you come back as Chris, while Claire was there, she ended up busting through walls. And now there's like frozen air coming into the facility. And she also drilled a hole into the side of the base, which allowed a lot of water and snow in. And that froze over. So whenever Chris visits the location, it is now all frozen over, and it completely changes the landscape of the Antarctic base. I think that's what makes it stand out so much, is that you get to visit this location with two unique perspectives, and I really like that. Number 3, the Baker Ranch in Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. So this probably surprises a lot of people because honestly, I can see myself putting the Antarctic base higher than this, and I went back and forth. I could easily switch the Antarctic base and this one back and forth so many times, but ultimately I went with the Baker Ranch as number 3. And the main reason for that has to do with how terrifying this location feels and how unique I find it. First off, you're located in a swamp over in Louisiana, which already stands out from the rest of the series because you never get to experience a location like that. But it also feels close to home because you're visiting a family's home, basically. So instead of visiting a military base or a prison like in Code Veronica or a umbrella lab or facility, you are actually located at someone's home throughout most of this game, throughout all of this game for the most part. And I think that's a unique concept that actually feels even more terrifying because it's closer to home. And of course, if it was just a single house, it would kind of probably be boring since you're just exploring a single house. So they actually make it unique by making this a full ranch with so many different structures. Because not only do you have the normal main house for the Baker family, but you also have a greenhouse, you have a guest house, you have a boathouse, you have a barn. You have to explore all these different locations, and each of these locations are unique and changes the immersive experience. So while the main house feels closer to home because it's just like a regular house as you're trying to escape this house and get out the front door and get away from Jack Baker, the other locations find ways to make them unique. For example, you have the old house, which pretty much is the house that was damaged during a hurricane, and then they rebuilt the house which is now the main house. So this is a house that no one really uses. Well, Marguerite has turned this house into a home for all of her bug-like creepy creatures. So it has a very unique cosmetic to it as you're exploring this specific location. Or you have the barn, which is pretty much Lucas's testing area, or his area where he has like a lot of traps set up and stuff. This is also where you get to experience the really fun and exciting birthday puzzle. Or you have the boathouse, which is pretty much just a boss fight against Jack Baker. There are some really unique locations in a ranch, which doesn't seem like it would have that many unique locations, but each of these locations definitely stand out and feel different. It's a very terrifying, horrifying experience, and I think it's definitely the scariest in the franchise, and the scenery and the location is a big reason for that. The Baker estate is forever etched in my mind, and that's why it takes the spot of number 3 on this list. Number 2, Spencer Mansion. And of course, this location has to break the top 2. And honestly, I can understand why people might put this location as the number 1 location in the franchise, because this is the big granddaddy of them all. This is where Resident Evil started at. The Spencer Mansion, the horror and the atmosphere of the Spencer Mansion is etched into my brain and is one of the most unique locations of the series. And I love every minute of it, especially if you play the Resident Evil 1 remake. You get to see the graphics that were ahead of its time when this remake came out, and you can see the Spencer Mansion in its full glory and everything. And honestly, just the music going through these halls and going to the guardhouse and fighting against a giant plant, going through a lab that is full with water and sharks, to fighting a giant ass snake in a small space in the attic. There's some really unique locations inside the Spencer Mansion, and honestly, this location just really screams terror, and I feel like it's one of the most iconic locations 100%. I don't care who you are, you have to admit that this deserves at least the top 3 spots. But let's talk about the different locations within the Spencer Mansion. So first off, you have the Spencer Mansion itself. I mentioned it has an attic, it has a library, you have a cabin in the woods in the remake, you have a graveyard in the remake, you have a secret lab underneath the Spencer Mansion. You have the guardhouse, which like I mentioned earlier has a giant plant plus giant spiders. And just this eerie location as you're going through the halls of the Spencer Mansion has never felt better. And honestly, it's really hard to compete with the Spencer Mansion. And I can only think of one location that stands above the Spencer Mansion. And let's get to it. I'm sure you guys have already guessed what that is. Number 1, the RPD Station in Raccoon City. Of course, this is the number 1 for me. First off, I gotta say that Resident Evil 2, the original, is my favorite game of all time. I love the original Resident Evil 2, and even the remake is really good and one of the best games I played too. But the RPD Station has just such a unique vibe to it. You take a place that you're supposed to feel safe in, that you're supposed to feel secure in, and then turn it into a nightmare. It changes the atmosphere and the feeling and the anxiety that's going through you as you're going through this RPD station. Because you see this safe place that's supposed to protect you, covered up with boards and blood and monsters and broken floors and creepy basements, because this structure was actually supposed to be a museum and then it turned into an RPD station. And because of that, you have a lot of unique artwork and puzzles throughout the RPD station. And while it doesn't have as many crazy over-the-top locations like the Spencer Mansion might have, the RPD station still feels close to my heart when I think about it. When I think about the RPD station and the Spencer Mansion together, and I think about walking into the Grand Hall and the main hall of the RPD station versus the Spencer Mansion, and ultimately, which one do I feel more nostalgia for? Which one actually helps me feel the terror of the situation you're in? And it's 100% the RPD station, because like I mentioned earlier, this is a safe place turned to your worst nightmare, and nothing's gonna be able to top that, honestly. It's really hard to top something like that. But that's going to do it for this episode of Nerd Space, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please hit up the comments. Let me know which location in the Resident Evil series is your favorite location in the franchise. And also, did I miss any really good locations? I know there's a lot of locations I missed out on, but these are personally my top 15. I'd love to know which ones that were on this list that you think should be on this list. Hit up those comments. Anyways, as always, guys, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you guys on the next Nerd Space. Take care.